to the New Orleans Museum of Art and to our temporary auditorium. We're so glad you're here this evening and delighted to be able to welcome you to this conversation or this talk by Teresita Fernández. We are grateful to the Helis Foundation for their sponsorship of this program. It's only because of them that it's possible to have a lecture in this space at this moment in time and with our wonderful artist, Teresita. The Helis Foundation's support, we are here to be responsive to the arts in this community and to the notion that is advanced by the Helis Foundation to advance access to the arts. And it enables us not only to have lectures like this, but the foundation also enables us to offer free admission to Louisiana residents every Wednesday, and their support also allows us to host internationally renowned artists for our ongoing artist talk series, such as this one this evening, which are all free and open to the public. Teresita Fernández is one of today's most engaging and interesting artists, best known for her monumental public projects that explore and expand on notions of landscape and place. Her work, often inspired by natural phenomena, meteor showers, the aurora borealis, cloud formations, fire, the night sky, a deep examination of mineral formations. All of these elements invite an experiential engagement with the work and the space that it inhabits. Fernández places particular importance on her choice of medium, playing with the possibilities and limitations of materials and employing those such as gold, graphite, and other minerals that often have loaded histories, sometimes associated with history itself, land, colonialism, and power. Her work is characterized by a quiet yet impactful unraveling of place, visibility, and erasure that actually results in an intimate experience for individual viewers. In 2015, Teresita installed her largest temporary public art project to date, Fata Morgana, in New York's Madison Square Park, which was truly a spectacular summer in Madison Square Park. In the fall of 2019, the retrospective Teresita Fernández Elemental opened at the Perez Art Museum in Miami, where it is currently on view, and then travels to the Phoenix Art Museum. The exhibition, a mid-career retrospective, surveys over 20 years of Teresita's work and explores the way in which her work has engaged in the dematerialization of landscape into its fundamental elements of light, space, darkness, and matter. In addition to the Perez, she's had a number of solo exhibitions, one organized at Harvard, the Olana site in Hudson, New York, Mass MoCA, Museum of Contemporary Art North Miami, Modern Art Museum of Fort Worth, and the Malaga Center for Contemporary Art in Spain, to name only a few. Teresita has created a number of site-specific commissions as well, including NOMA's Viñales, Mayombe, Mississippi, in the courtyard of the new sculpture pavilion, located in the 6.5-acre expansion of the Sidney and Walda Besthoff Sculpture Garden. This, as you all know, opened in May and has since become a magnet for visitors from across the city and beyond. Thus far, since its opening, we have shared the sculpture garden with over 200,000 people. Tonight, she will share her process for this mural and her ongoing ideas for engagement that reflect Teresita's exploration of landscape, community, and site. We're so delighted to have her here tonight. Please join me in welcoming Teresita Fernández.
Thank you, Susan, for that very generous introduction. And And I also wanted to thank my gallery, Lehman Maupin, because they do a lot of behind-the-scenes support that enables my work to happen. And thank you to everyone here at the museum who helped organize tonight's lecture, as well as the installation of the work outside. So I'm going to speak for, I don't know, about maybe 35, 40 minutes. And I speak kind of quickly, so you have to kind of keep up with me. Yeah, I'll just start. I'm going to start by quickly giving you a sense of my work often gets described as being about landscape and uses this inquiry of place as a constant exercise to calibrate where we are, and by extension, how we position ourselves in relation to one another. When I first begin a site-specific project, there we go. When I first begin a site-specific project, I always ask myself this very basic question: where am I? Where am I culturally, racially, socially, historically, geographically, politically, agriculturally, conceptually, visually, architecturally, psychologically, legally, demographically, economically, environmentally, etymologically? Not just what are the physical coordinates of this place, but more like how does this place exist in our imagination? And more importantly, how do we construct a narrative about who we are based on where we are? And these are just some examples of some of the pieces that I've done in the past. So in this amplified understanding of what landscape can be, we start to understand it less like a romanticized Frederick Church painting depicting a picturesque fixed view of the American landscape, and more like Standing Rock, or the flowing of toxic waters in the Flint River in Michigan, or a mass grave on the Texas side of the US-Mexican border. This too is the landscape. So I'm interested in this idea of landscape as the history of power, the history of colonialism, ownership, oppression. In this way, landscape is really much more about what you don't see than what you do see. This is a sculpture, and I'm going to start with some older works just to kind of show you the thread of my conceptual thinking behind some of these pieces, and I'll end with the piece that's outside in the sculpture garden. So this is a piece titled Ink Mirror. It's made of high-polished black fiberglass and marble. And it was inspired by my fascination with this object called a clawed glass. A clawed glass was an early 19th century visual tool used by landscape painters who wanted to paint like Claude Lorraine. It's essentially a black mirror, slightly convex, and it's usually made of polished obsidian. It doesn't produce a true reflection, but rather depicts and reflects the deepest tones and the brightest highlights, kind of like the earliest version of a Photoshop filter. And the way it would be used is that painters would go out to paint a landscape on site. They would turn their backs to the subject, and they would paint from the image reflected in the glass. But oddly enough, it also started to be used by people who weren't painting, people making pilgrimages to famous sites or abbeys, who would use it almost as a way of viewing or containing the image, like a portable temporary postcard. And what fascinated me about all of this was this idea of turning one's back to something in order to see it, which of course implied a less obvious way of seeing, a different way of seeing. It's no coincidence that all throughout literature, the wise oracle or the prophesier is always often blind. And this idea started to inform everything that I thought about the landscape, being precisely about what you don't see. I often use this idea of blindness in my work so that while we look, this sense of place of what we're looking at is not passive, but it also quietly stares right back at us, revealing much of what we've left out and what our own narrative or our own version of looking omits. So these images are of Naoshima, Japan. This is the Seto Inland Sea. Naoshima is a tiny island in the Seto Inland Sea. And it's this very ghostly, otherworldly kind of landscape where I was fortunate enough to do this installation. This is a night view of a piece called Blind Blue Landscape. It's installed on a ramp in the Dawando building. It's about 40 feet long on a curved wall that faces windows that look out on that seascape. So this is the view outside the wall where the work is installed. And the piece is made of tens of thousands of different size glass cubes that are mirrored on one side. And the wall becomes a mirror to this outside view, essentially bringing the landscape indoors, but also distorting it and breaking it up, and also reflecting your own image superimposed onto that landscape. So that each tiny cube becomes almost like a miniature landscape painting of the view behind you. And as often happens with my work, one place serendipitously leads to another. So this is the center of town in Naoshima. It's a small, mostly undeveloped island, and this tiny town has always been a fishing village, not a whole lot there. The houses in this region of Japan are often burned with this traditional technique called shosugi-bound, sometimes it's called yakisugi, and it's used to preserve the wood, and oddly enough, as a way of keeping it from catching fire. So all of the buildings in this area near Okayama are like this. They have these burned surfaces. In some areas, the wood is so shiny that it looks blue because it's actually reflecting the blue sky. It's this very beautiful surface that I was fascinated by. And I became really intrigued with this experience of walking around the town that I started to see almost like a full-scale, three-dimensional charcoal drawing, leading me to think about the history of landscape drawing and specifically the history of pencils. You could see here where you could touch one of these buildings and it would be almost like smudging a drawing. So all of that led me, this interest in landscape drawing and the history of pencils and graphite, led me far away from that Naoshima fishing village to Borrowdale in the Cumbria region of England. Borrowdale is a rural area where graphite was first discovered in the early 1500s, and the locals there originally used it for marking sheep. This particular deposit of graphite was extremely pure and solid, and it could be easily sawed into sticks. So the pencil industry was born nearby in Keswick. Although graphite is found in some form all over the world, this was and remains the only deposit of graphite ever found in solid form. So I started to imagine Borrowdale, much like that Japanese fishing village, like one solid subterranean drawings upon drawings, both as marks and as these sculptural reliefs. So this is all made out of graphite. From far away, these graphite pieces look like flat, abstract paintings. And then the image only emerges when you get near to the surface and those relief surfaces start to catch the light. So it's almost like a slow dissolve, and there's a very sort of cinematic quality to it. So, or it's a little bit like being in a dark room and watching an image develop before your eyes. And I started to make all kinds of big immersive installations with solid chunks of graphite, like this series called Sfumato. And this, which is called Drawn Waters Borrowdale, which I think of as a drawing that's also a sculpture, or a sculpture that has been drawn. It's made entirely of solid graphite. The upper portion is machined graphite, and the portion on the bottom is basically what raw graphite looks when it's taken out of a mine. So this particular graphite comes from a mine in Sri Lanka. So to assemble the parts of this sculpture is also to build a graphite drawing, to draw in space. And there were many sort of associations with land art that I was also thinking of as I created these pieces. This is another series called Night Writing. When I made this series, I was thinking of the night sky as a legible surface. The stars are our first calendar, our first clock, the place where we as humans have always looked for orientation and for information since the beginning of time. In fact, much of our language has etymology rooted in the importance that was given to the night sky. Like for the word disaster, for example, means bad star. There are whole patterns of text that are blown through handmade paper. This is all pulp paper, and so these holes have been blown through with pressurized air. And there's a mirror placed behind the paper. This is called Night Writing, Hero and Leander, this particular piece. In the early 19th century, Napoleon put out an order for someone in his army to design a system of communication so that his soldiers could communicate at night silently and without light. There was a captain in his French army named Charles Barbier, and Barbier invented what is called night writing, or écriture nocturne. And what it basically consisted of is a piece of cardboard with holes in it that corresponded to the French language. And it was very inefficient. It never worked. It was never implemented by the army at all. But a couple of years later, he visited the Institute for the Blind in Paris, which is the first institute for the blind anywhere in the world. And there was a teenager in the audience named Louis Braille. And Louis Braille, as a teenager, basically what he did is he took this system that Barbier designed that was never used for communicating at night, and he perfected it and he simplified it so that each cipher could fit on a fingertip. And the work, Night Writing, is really about this connection between the tactile and the visual. My interest in blindness is less physical and more about the idea of not seeing and about erasure. You can rephrase blindness, you can think of blindness in terms of the varieties of not seeing: shadows, darkness, inaccessibility, denial, cloaking, peeking, squinting, hiding, camouflaging. These two are degrees of blindness, though less specific to the physicality of the eye and more inextricably linked to thinking, dreaming, imagining. Making these kind of visual constructions in our mind's eye. So again, like that cloud glass, something is revealed to you by seeing less. It's a different kind of vision. And so what I did with these pieces is that I created these texts made out of Braille patterns that become also these constellations in the sky. The visual and each one of these little holes is basically the pulp paper that's been punctured with a mirror behind it. So when you walk in front of these pieces, it's a kind of dazzling, kind of shimmering surface that's catching the light. But if you go up close, you can actually see your own reflection in each of those little holes. And the idea is that the visual, untouchable Braille becomes absurdly illegible to both the blind and the sign. And so I'm taking these two languages and superimposing them on one another, this language of the constellations and this language of Braille, and the actual text that it's spelling out. And I'm kind of rendering it all completely mute and abstract. This is an installation called Black Sun. It was in a show that I did at Mass MoCA called As Above, So Below. The piece is about 100 feet long, and it's experienced from underneath as well as from the second and third floor balconies. And it was inspired in part by Mesoamerican mythology, the world imagined as an above and a below, with the sun god disappearing underneath you into the western entrance into the underworld. And these explanations of day and night, light and darkness, the diurnal and nocturnal workings of the universe, but also of our own bodies and how we become immense when we correlate our own bodily rhythms to the visible world. This is a piece called Rorschach. It's a sculpture which works almost like a three-dimensional ink blot, mirroring itself both horizontally and vertically. I'll speak about this a little later, a little more, but the use of gold in my work is always a reference to colonization. The history of gold as a material is also always the history of landscape, of land and conquest and power and of erasure. This is a piece titled Fata Morgana, which I did a few years ago in New York City, as Susan mentioned, in Madison Square Park. The title comes from Fata Morgana, from this optical illusion. So in nature, a Fata Morgana looks like this. It's a superior mirage seen hovering over the horizon. And again, as above, so below, there's this use of metal, of gold metal. I'm not using real gold, so you don't have to ask that at the end. And I'm using it both as a reference to mining and the subterranean, as well as to light and sun and the cosmos overhead. The piece basically covered all of the walkways of the park, and it would absorb and reflect back the image of whatever was happening at the time. So for example, if there were colorful tulips in the spring, the whole piece would turn like it does in this picture. In the winter when there was snow, the whole piece would just turn white. If a group of nursery school kids with yellow shirts on would walk underneath it, the whole piece turns yellow. And so this is very activated, kind of dynamic surface that always meant that the piece was changing. So what I was trying to do is I like this idea that the mirage distorts the landscape on this grandiose scale. And I was interested in making a sculpture on this grand scale that would distort and abstract its surrounding, a kind of ghostly apparition. People becoming the shapes of these cutout foliage patterns above them. About 60,000 people walk through this park every day. And so in many ways, it was kind of almost like a portrait of the urban commute. In many of my public projects, in most of my public projects, the physical structure that I'm constructing, that you're seeing, is always happening at the same time as the social structure that I'm building alongside it. One is used in service of the other, so that the work takes up public space, like this, but the context for it is also happening behind the scenes and being made visible through the programming. In this case, for this piece, all of the programming was about erasure and visibility, everything in the piece being doubled, becoming doubly present. So what you're seeing in this image is a recreation of Dia de Reyes, which in colonial times in Cuba was the only day of the year that enslaved individuals could perform their music and dance in public space. And I'll talk a little bit more about public space later, but the entire park was activated around it, and everything that was happening underneath this was actually a religious ceremony. What was happening underneath it was reflected above, doubled above in this overhead mirror. And I'm also not showing you a lot of things. I mean, there are like dozens of pieces that I'm just omitting because of the length of time that we have, and because I want to focus on speaking about the piece that's in the sculpture garden, which is the first time I'll speak about that is tonight, actually, publicly. This is Fire America and Burned Landscapes. This is two pieces that are installed as an installation. For the last couple of years, I've been making work that deals specifically with American identity, and its and I say American and kind of in quotations, and its mutable nature, or who gets excluded or omitted from those definitions, often defined by the land itself. It is only in the United States that the word America is used in its singular form. In the rest of the Western Hemisphere, it is understood and referred to in the plural, the Americas, las Americas. Fire America is a reference to how American violence is framed according to who is telling the story. It is also a reference to slash and burn techniques used by indigenous people to successfully shape and cultivate the land. Contrary to popular belief, the Americas were not an untouched virgin wilderness paradise at the time of European contact, but rather a human-made landscape carefully maintained in very sophisticated ways by indigenous people who had kept it fertile and productive for thousands of years by burning it. They would have us believe that both the people and the land had no real history. This notion, this myth that the indigenous people of the Americas floated changelessly through the millennia until 1492 is what we have been repeatedly conditioned to believe, erasing the fact that it was in fact made up of a densely populated network of urban centers that at the time far exceeded the size of London or Seville at the time. The indigenous people of the Americas created sustainable soil, hunted, navigated, gave the world 3/5 of the crops now in cultivation, developed written languages, domesticated animals, built pyramids, ball courts, plazas, observatories, palaces, temples, aqueducts, reservoirs, compasses. They practiced medicine, worked in metal and stone, generated poetry, created libraries and schools, established elaborate trade routes and governments, calculated cosmic events with great precision, and invented the zero. So there was a whole lot going on here before European contact. As if the history of gold and land and power will forever repeat itself, gold would be made famous again in the context of the California Gold Rush, which began in 1848. The news of gold brought some 300,000 gold seekers to California from the rest of the United States and from abroad. The sudden influx of immigrants into the money supply radically reinvigorated the United States economy. The United States needed immigrants, basically, to be what it is. Many black miners worked alongside Chinese, Latin American, and European miners. Frederick Douglass published accounts of successful black miners in his paper, The North Star. Many were brought as slaves, working to earn their freedom and paying for the freedom of their families by mining for gold. Many white American miners shared the sentiment that had become widespread after the recently concluded Mexican-American War. And they were outraged that quote-unquote foreigners, mainly Latinos, but also Chinese and other non-citizens, were taking the gold that they thought was rightfully theirs. The Mexicans found that in California, a place that had so recently been their home, they were now considered foreigners, with their land often being taken from them at gunpoint. Anti-Latino sentiments ran high during the gold rush, in part because many Mexicans, Peruvians, and Chileans had far greater mining experience and expertise than their white counterparts, promoting vigilantes to violently drive away large numbers of them and their families. Americans are largely unaware that Mexicans were frequently the targets of lynch mobs from the mid-19th century until well into the 20th century, second only to African-American lynchings in the South in scale and in scope of the crimes. From 1848 to 1928 alone, mobs murdered thousands of Mexicans. Those surviving records allow us to clearly document about 547 of them. These lynchings occurred not only in the southwestern states of Arizona, California, New Mexico, and Texas, but also in states far from the border like Nebraska and Wyoming. And I promise you this is about my work. It's connecting. Today, that same anti-Latinx, anti-Latino, anti-Latinx sentiment is still being fueled. But as if history were slowly correcting itself, California is once again a majority Latino state, and the rest of this country steadily inches its way to being made up of majority people of color. Today, 1 in 5 American citizens under 18 identifies as Latinx, and by 2050, that number in this country will double. To put this into perspective, every 30 seconds, a Latinx US citizen reaches voting age. In 1846, so this is a piece that I made called Fire United States of the Americas. It's all made out of charcoal. In 1846, shortly after the annexation of Texas, President Polk ordered US troops into disputed lands, precipitating a war against Mexico. The war ended with the forced Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848. So I made this piece 2 years ago now, Fire United States of the Americas. It's made out of lumped charcoal that's been assembled into these shapes of the states, and then there's a drawing on the wall. And I've done this in many different iterations depending on where it's being installed. Until 1848, portions of Texas, California, Arizona, New Mexico, Nevada, Utah, Colorado, and Wyoming were part of Mexico. This is what Chicano activists mean when they say that the border crossed them. Today, 33.5 million people of Mexican origin live in the US, and this too is the story of the landscape. The work is made, as I said, entirely of charcoal. Charcoal is made of burned trees, assembled and drawn again as a puzzle that has never made much sense in its geometric shapes that seem to defy the natural features in the landscape, where the pieces look like ruins and seem to slip and burn, while also allowing us to point and reshape and rectify narratives about the history of place and land and people. The piece is currently installed at my mid-career retrospective in Miami, where I created a site-specific version with the shape of Mexico looming large over the US and turning into the cosmos, and the surrounding horizon line studded with an archipelago of burning islands. The maps that you look at, by the way, do not represent Mexico at its accurate scale. Mexico is much bigger than what it looks like on the maps, just as Alaska is not quite that big. So this is actually not that inaccurate, but the idea was that it was made so large that it turned into the cosmos as this kind of like poetic gesture, juxtaposing it next to the shape of the United States. And this is a brand new outdoor work that I just did that's also at my mid-career retrospective now. It's titled Solarium Sanctuary, and it's made of mirror-polished stainless steel. The immersive sculpture invites visitors to physically enter its optically shifting structure to see their distorted reflections, as well as those of the surroundings within the woven, perforated, ivy-like formations. The title fuses the words solarium, which is a glass-enclosed sunroom that offers views of the landscape, with the word sanctuary, which I use specifically here to refer to sanctuary cities throughout the United States that have offered protection for asylum seekers fleeing violence and civil wars in Central America since the 1980s. And this is a sculpture that I did some years ago called Viñales, Reclining Nude. It is actually the inspiration for the monumental wall that I created here for the Besthoff Sculpture Garden. It plays with this notion of the landscape as a human that contains collective or erased memory. The nude, the landscape, is a reference to Viñales in Cuba, where my family is from. This is Viñales. Viñales is a rural valley, and it's the oldest part of the island. It's a karstic landscape characterized by these strange-looking mogotes, and the whole thing is very surreal-looking in shape and light, and this very saturated, almost neon green coloration. This valley was formed underwater, rising from the sea millions of years ago. If you walk around it, you can see ancient fossils that can still be found in caves here that dot the landscape. It's also an iconic place in the Cuban imagination. Even though from the outside, Cuba is somehow always visually represented or imagined as Havana in the 1950s with the cars, it's rarely seen as a prehistoric place or an ancient place or a colonized place made up of indigenous and displaced diasporic people. So I was kind of trying to look at that place with a different language. And here's another angle of the original sculpture. I made this piece, this is a close-up of the piece you just saw. I made this piece with malachite that was mined from the Democratic Republic of Congo. And I had found this piece of malachite, this very massive piece of malachite from Congo, and it looked like an uncanny miniature version of the Viñales landscape that I was so familiar with. And so I decided to make this sculpture that kind of fused these ideas. The rocks in the piece appear like far away, kind of these bird's eye view of a landscape, and other times you can get very close to the piece and you can get up, almost like entering these little cave formations and these crevices, which visually seem to expand and contract. It's almost as though you as a viewer, as you get close to this, become the size of the thing that you're looking at. The idea is often what I called stacked landscapes, so that the material that you see here is literally physically part of a landscape, a real landscape, in this case, the Congo, the Democratic Republic of Congo. But it's being used to describe or create another image of the landscape, Viñales. And in the process, what I'm doing is connecting the relationship between these two places, confirming that we're always essentially occupying more than one landscape simultaneously. And so I want to go back to that Viñales landscape to talk about how we constructed ideas about place. It's important to know that Viñales has an extensive cave system used since prehistoric times by humans. And in them you can find petroglyphs. I'm standing inside the caves looking out as I take these photographs that you'll see now. So here I am in the cave looking out at the landscape. Before colonization, these caves were occupied by Taino indigenous people, and later these same caves were often the refuge for cimarrones, or enslaved individuals who had run away from surrounding plantations, often forming small communes hiding in these caves by day. As a reminder, because we also sometimes suffer from American exceptionalism, slavery in Cuba started 100 years before that of the British colonies in the Americas, and it lasted more than 2 decades after it was abolished in the United States. So this is Viñales, Mayombe, Mississippi. Viñales is the place in Cuba I just spoke to. Mayombe is a forested area in the Congo, in Africa. And Mississippi is where we are. And I wanted to walk you through a little bit how the idea of the work basically places New Orleans in a global context by drawing connections between these different scale geographic locations of continent, country, and city. And what I was trying to do by referring to these three places, Africa, Cuba, and New Orleans, is to weave together and sort of expose the cultural, demographic, economic, and historical relationship between these three different scaled geographic locations. So here landscape is understood as unearthing the hidden post-colonial violence as well. The first thing that I do when I make a site-specific work, which is what this was, is I ask myself again this very basic question: where am I? I'm going back to that question. How does this place exist in our collective imagination? And there's often a lot of research that goes into sort of peeling back all of those layers of understanding what we think we know and why we think that about that particular place. So my goal was to really sort of think and create this image of New Orleans and to imagine New Orleans not just as a local place, but rather to place New Orleans as the center of the world in many different ways. Some to be celebrated, like its completely unique cultural history, the birthplace of jazz. Others to never forget sort of the devastating violence of slavery or the destruction from Katrina. But nevertheless, asking ourselves, where are we with a sense of this being a city that has always been connected to the rest of the world? When we imagine New Orleans, we don't think of any one thing, and this is precisely what its unique importance is about. New Orleans is many things and many people and many histories all at once. It is a stacked landscape. Its richness comes from how all of it is happening simultaneously, a kind of crossroads that creates something that is much more than the sum of its parts. I was really interested in this idea, as a Cuban, of New Orleans as the northernmost Caribbean city. And that is a reference that comes from an article in the Boston Globe a long time ago, as well as other travel guides, due in part to the similarities of culture with the Caribbean islands. In one sighting, NOLA was called the wealthiest Caribbean city, and in most ways it feels more like Havana or Cartagena or Port-au-Prince than like a US city. New Orleans was home to Standard Fruit, now Dole, and United Fruit, Chiquita. They exerted so much power and dominance in Latin America that the term Banana Republic was born. The historical, cultural, demographic, economic, and cultural ties between Cuba and Louisiana are firm and deep. At the beginning of the 19th century, trade primarily in coffee, sugar, and enslaved individuals meant heavy travel between Cuba and Louisiana. There were periodic exoduses from one place or another. And even after slavery was abolished, on maps showing shipping routes, New Orleans and Havana reflect the two ports with dual influence and their domination of trade moving through the Caribbean and Europe. In 1809, a huge influx of plantation owners and free black people who had fled the Haitian Revolution passed through Cuba and into Louisiana, doubling the population of New Orleans. In the 19th century, most of the free people of color came to New Orleans from either Haiti or Cuba. The sea train New Orleans was a 4-deck ferry that ran twice daily from Belchase to, did I say that right? Belchase? New Orleans to Havana from 1929 right up until the Cuban Revolution in 1959. Cars and passengers were loaded and unloaded by crane and cradles onto the sea ferry, onto the sea train. And it not only facilitated constant daily trading of products and goods, but also cultural exchange with family, commercial and cultural connections in place from the 19th century, and many people commuting daily, weekly, back and forth between Havana and New Orleans. Afro-Cuban music began influencing African-American music. That twice-daily ferry that used to run between Havana and New Orleans also carried musicians who would ride back and forth to learn from and perform with each other. And so much of the history of jazz, what we think of as American jazz, of course develops from this cultural exchange between black New Orleans musicians and Afro-Cuban musicians. This is the great Cuban percussionist Chano Pozo and Dizzy Gillespie. The habanera was a rhythmic pattern that heavily influenced early jazz genres. Jelly Roll Morton described it as the Spanish tinge, which is, by the way, it's a mistake. It's not Spanish. It's Cuban and it's Afro-Cuban. It's Black Cuban. But he called it Spanish tinge because, of course, they spoke Spanish in Cuba. But it did not refer to Spanish culture. It rather referred to the habanera rhythms of the Cuban contradanza, what is known in Latin music as the habanera, as the tango conga and the tresillo are in fact two of the most basic rhythms found in sub-Saharan music traditions, and many of you know some of this, of course, because you live here. They were brought to Cuba via the Atlantic slave trade, and they were brought to New Orleans as well through this contact with the Caribbean. So this all brings us back to placing ourselves in the specificity of New Orleans being truly unlike any other U.S. city. I wanted to point out Congo Square here in the city grid. And I wanted to discuss Congo Square as public space, because what I made outside is a public work of art in a free, accessible public park. And that's really interesting to me. And there's the aspect of public art being thoroughly democratic, which is, it isn't always, is one of the things that makes me so interested in public art and in public space. Yeah, I was interested in this idea of how public art becomes an act of democracy when it lives in these publicly accessible places. Congo Square is near, so I'm going to skip over some of this because you know this. So this is Congo Square today. You know, by 1819, these gatherings numbered as many as 500, 600 people. You all understand really well the importance of how this space is both old and contemporary and historic and all of those things. The celebration is so infused in our imaginations. This is what we think of when we think of New Orleans. We think of Mardi Gras, we think of Second Line, we think of all of these musical genres. When I'm in New Orleans, I feel like I'm in Havana. And in the pictures, as I was doing all of this research, it was actually hard to tell which ones were New Orleans and which ones were Havana. I had to label each one of my pictures to not mix them up. So this is Havana. In colonial times in Cuba, as I mentioned before, Dia de Reyes was the only day that enslaved Africans really had access to public space, and that they were permitted, the only time that they were permitted to freely occupy and use public space to all kinds of performative music, dance. Like Congo Square, this is the plaza in front of the Catedral de La Habana, the Havana Cathedral, and the modern day carnival traditions that continue to be reenacted in Cuba, claiming and celebrating public space as free and open. The similarities, this is Havana, the similarities are of course uncanny. So this is an image of the Great Mississippi, the lifeline of New Orleans. This is the Cauto River, the biggest river that runs through Cuba. And this is the River Congo, which is the second longest river in Africa after the Nile and the second largest river in the world. This is New Orleans. This is Cuba. This is what today we call the Democratic Republic of Congo. This is New Orleans. This is Cuba. And this is the Democratic Republic of Congo. And so these are all of the things that I was thinking about when I made the piece outside. The piece outside, the image is made from a piece of rock that comes from the Congo. And I am connecting these three places through this image, which is this very sort of beautiful abstract image that has all of these things layered onto it. So it isn't just about the image, it's about all of these things as well. I was also thinking a lot about these ideas materially, and this is important too when I talk about stacked landscapes and one thing being more than, places being more than one thing. The Viñales mosaic pieces are made from clay. So clay is essentially earth, it's just the landscape. The glazes that are on it are just minerals taken from the ground, mined from the ground, and fired at a very high temperature. So the whole piece is actually made, just like that charcoal drawing that was made from burned trees. You know, these glazed ceramic pieces into new forms. The image on the left becomes the image on the right, and then becomes, you know, this landscape, these materials from the landscape become the familiar colors and surfaces that we think of as specific places. And I believe this is my last slide. This is, the piece really seeks to mark a public space that is both global and local, macro and micro, ancient and contemporary, immense and intimate, reminding us that if we look carefully enough, we see that we are always in more than one place at once, and that locating ourselves within place and asking some of those hard questions of where am I, and moving our blinders, is what enables us to not only understand ourselves and the places that we live in, but also our relationship to one another. That's it.